Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
ピーク人間
I talk to a lot of great people on this podcast, but this may be the man who really knows the stuff at the deepest level and most qualified to talk about fat adaptation and ketogenic diets and therapies. He has been doing amazing work in this field for such a long time. Dr. Jeff Volek is a professor, researcher, registered dietitian, and co-founder and chief science officer of Virta Health. For the last 2 decades, Dr. Volek has performed cutting-edge research on how humans adapt to diets restricted in carbohydrates with a dual focus on clinical and performance applications of nutritional ketosis. His scholarly work includes more than 300 peer-reviewed scientific manuscripts and 5 books, including a New York Times bestseller, and he has provided more than 200 lectures at scientific and industry conferences around the world. He's an all-around great guy and someone I admire. He very rarely does interviews, so I was honored to spend some time with him. He is busy running his lab at OSU while also being a co-founder of a major health company I mention a lot called Virta. My company, Sapien, which you can find out more about at sapien.org, is producing technology similar to them. They use an app as well as devices like a smart scale to help monitor patients and keep them accountable, as well as communicate with a health coach as they reverse type 2 diabetes with diet and lifestyle. We're doing the same thing at Sapien, so if you are a healthcare provider or health coach and are interested in our platform, please reach out to us via our site, sapien.org. Before we start the interview, I want to ask people who have gotten any value out of this podcast to support me by contributing to the Food Lies Film Indiegogo campaign. Go to foodlies.org and pre-order the film or check out the great perks we're offering like the Eat Meat shirt, movie poster, and Real Foods coin. We rely on the community to make this podcast and film a reality. I'm seriously on my last dollar here, and the post-production of the film is slowing down due to budget constraints. I really appreciate the support. You can also click through the show notes in your podcast app to support the film. Thanks, and here's Dr. Jeff Volek. Let's jump right in here. Dr. Volek, thanks for coming on the show with me.
My pleasure, Brian. Happy to be here.
Yeah, well, I've had all kinds of guests on, and you're kind of the original researcher in this field with Dr. Finney, and I'm sure there's others that have come before you throughout history, but in the modern times, you've done some great work, and you're still at OSU. You have a lab still doing this stuff?
Yeah, I've been at Ohio State now for almost 5 years, and I have a great team here that's all motivated and passionate to advance the knowledge and application of ketogenic diets. So it makes it fun to wake up in the morning and come to work, even though we've got a lot of battles and obstacles to overcome. It's a great time to be doing research and trying to answer questions and move this whole field forward.
Yeah, it really is. And you were at the conference in Long Beach where that was the goal, is kind of to get the science out to the people. And so I think this is a good time. It's kind of like a hot space right now, which kind of is a problem. Maybe we can get into this later about, the mainstream idea of what, quote, keto is and then what ketogenic metabolic therapies are. So you're looking at the latter.
Well, my interests are quite broad when it comes to ketosis, and you mentioned it's really popular now, and that is sort of a double-edged sword in that there's no doubt ketones and ketogenic diets have been living in the shadows for far too long for a variety of reasons. And we're really shining light on that now. But, because of that, there's also a lot of charlatans and a lot of misinformation and misconceptions out there on the internet, which makes it somewhat frustrating because as a scientist, I'm very motivated to want to present things accurately and inform people with the best information we have now. And there still are a lot of questions. But again, my interests are pretty broad. I'm interested in everything from clinical applications in a variety of different diseases, ranging from diabetes to cancer to heart disease, etc., all the way to the other end of the spectrum, trying to understand how ketosis might benefit athletes and even military personnel is where we're spending a lot of time now, how we can improve soldier health, help them perform better in the field, both physically, cognitively, as well as recover faster and just deal with the multiple challenges and stressors that they're dealing with So, in many ways, anything related to ketones and how humans respond at a mechanistic level as well as a very applied level, how we can help people actually achieve this state is of interest to me. So there's no limit to the questions out there that that we want to study and help move this field forward.
That's awesome. Yeah. Why don't we start with more general clinical applications? I read The Art and Science of Low Carb Living, which was kind of aimed more at clinicians and anyone in the healthcare field, but also at the general public. So I enjoyed it and had a lot of good takeaways from that. But what was the sort of main message with that first book you wrote?
Yeah, I mean, it was an enjoyable book to write with my good friend and colleague Steve Finney. We set out from the start. We had a goal of wanting to just get the information out. Steve's just the virtual encyclopedia of knowledge when it comes to ketogenic diet. So it's just been a real privilege to be able to interact and learn from Steve. He's been in the trenches doing work on ketogenic diets going back to the late 70s and 80s. So he's been at it a long, long time and taken a lot of arrows. But our goal was really to provide a resource for people on ketogenic diets because there's no real curriculum out there, whether you're a doctor, a dietitian, any healthcare professional that teaches ketogenic diets. So we wanted to be a resource for people interested in getting credible information on a ketogenic diet. We decided early on we didn't want to write a textbook that was kind of dry and densely referenced. We wanted to try to hit a middle of the road type writing style where it was technical enough that it was credible and able to accurately portray the current level of scientific knowledge, but try to reach the educated layperson as well, so it wasn't unreachable to the general person that just wanted to understand this better. And whether we were successful or not might be debatable, but that was kind of the intent, to make it a little more reachable to the average person, but not really a lay person book either. I mean, this is not the type of book someone just off the street that had no background in nutrition or biology would be able to understand. So that was sort of the intent. And it's been amazing watching the book sell over the last, I think, 6-7 years now since we wrote The Art and Science of Low Carb Living. We don't do a lot of marketing of the book, but it has sustained pretty high sales over that time period, which to us reflects the fact that people are finding it useful and recommending it to their friends and colleagues, and it's just kind of had a slow burn in that regard.
Yeah. And I think it's perfect for the audience listening. They're kind of in the sweet spot of not just an off the street person, but kind of savvy with some of the stuff. And one thing that I thought was interesting that I didn't hear before reading it was the idea of being carb intolerant. People know of lactose intolerance or gluten intolerance, but you guys brought up carb intolerance, which is a nice way of framing it, I think.
I think it's an accurate way to really explain what amounts to some very complex underlying physiology, because really what carb intolerance is describing is the insulin resistant phenotype. And insulin resistance is a very complex, in many ways, completely misunderstood concept that underlies diabetes as well as other chronic diseases. And many scientists have made careers trying to understand the molecular underpinnings of insulin resistance. And there's no doubt there's a lot yet to learn about insulin resistance. But what we do know is that a fundamental aspect of insulin resistance is that it manifests as an inefficient ability to metabolize carbohydrate or glucose. And in that way, if you have insulin resistance, you're not processing carbohydrates in a healthy way. You have a problem getting glucose into cells and metabolizing it. And so functionally, it does manifest as a carbohydrate intolerance. And I think that's a term we've heard in other regards, whether it be lactose intolerance or gluten intolerance. And it's just sort of common sense, if you're intolerant to a nutrient, that you would need to minimize it to a level that you could tolerate. And that's really the whole idea or principle, if you will, behind the low carb diet, is that it's not a cookie cutter type prescription that works for everybody. It really depends on an individual's level of carbohydrate intolerance, what level of carb restriction they require to achieve good health.
Yeah. And it seems so simple when you put it that way. So I hope the general public can kind of accept this, and that people make arguments like, oh, well, we've been eating carbohydrates for all of history. And there's a lot to that. You know, a lot of those were obviously whole food carbohydrates and not the processed ones that we're eating today. So yeah, what do you think that's changed in that regard? And what percentage of the population do you think is carb tolerant?
Well, if we look at statistics, in the U.S. we have 2/3 of the population overweight. About 40% are obese, and over a half, just slightly over half adults in the U.S. have either prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. I mean, it's just astonishing when you think about the average person now actually has diabetes or is on the fast track to developing it. So I think it's fair to say probably half the adults in the US have some degree of insulin resistance. And that's an important point, is it's not, a binary type situation where, you flip a switch and suddenly you have insulin resistance or you don't have it. It's more of a continuum, and it manifests in slightly different ways in different people. So it's more of a spectrum or a continuum of gradations of insulin resistance or carb intolerance that people have. But going back to the idea that populations have consumed carbs, that's true. But if you go back even before the agricultural revolution, which was give or take 10,000 years ago, the majority of time humans had very little access to carbohydrate. So if humans have been around for a couple million years, the vast majority of time we've been on this planet, we were not eating a lot of agricultural carbohydrates and definitely not a lot of sugar. So, you can argue that from an evolutionary standpoint, low carb, ketogenic type diets were actually what our bodies were meant to run on. I mean, we have a very strong evolutionary adaptation to low carbohydrate ketogenic diets. And it's only more recently that we've been exposed to agricultural carbs and sugar. And that's, causing many people to run into problems with their health and develop prediabetes and eventually diabetes and other chronic diseases. But that's not to say people can't maintain good health on high carb diets. That's certainly possible. It's just there are certain genetic predetermined aspects of our biology that some people are dealt cards where they don't have good carb tolerance and they need to maintain some level of carb restriction. This is where personalized nutrition and individualized diet prescriptions are really where we need to go.
Yeah. So I've heard a lot of people talk about maybe 30% of people in the population can handle carbs and maybe 70% can't in this modern environment we're in. Do you think that's kind of correct?
Well, I don't think anyone knows for sure. It's probably a good ballpark, but it kind of depends how you define current environment. Because I would say if you're talking about the standard American diet right now, which is pretty dense in processed carbohydrates and added sugars, including fructose, I would even argue if that's your definition of the current food landscape, that again the numbers are showing it's much more than 30% are metabolically not well. If it's a diet that's less processed, less added sugars, then maybe it would be closer to 30% of people with some degree of problems with that type of diet. So, there's a lot of context there. But again, this is part of the problem in studying nutrition, is that there's a wide variety of responses to the same foods that people consume. And so sorting all this out is anything but trivial.
Exactly. And do you think carb tolerance goes down with age?
Yes, that's another really important part of this. There's not only variability between people, but within a person, your carb tolerance changes over time. So yes, as you age, your carb tolerance or your insulin resistance gets worse. But it could also be affected by, whether or not you're training or there's stress, in your life at a particular time. So it can even be a moving target within a person, and you may have to adjust your carbohydrate level depending on some of these factors. But surely age is a big one, as you point out. You may be able to tolerate a couple 100 grams of carbs a day in your teens and 20s. You hit middle age, suddenly, you're gaining weight, becoming pre-diabetic, and that same level of carbs is, you just can't metabolize it the same way. And as you get into your 60s and 70s, it potentially even worse. So So I do think people need to be more conscientious of carbs as they get older.
Well, a lot of people just think that that's what happens when you age. It's like, oh yeah, you just get a little heavier, you get that belly going as, the dad bod or whatever as you get to middle age. But really, that's not how humans are supposed to be, probably, right? It just means that you're probably just more carb tolerant and you need to be eating a different diet.
Yeah, I think, it's a little hard to tell how much of it's normal aging or how much of it is a response to the food that you're eating over time. Regardless, though, the solution is cutting back on carbs as you get older. And that's the beauty. I mean, outside of some rare genetic mutations, everybody can adapt to a low carb diet. So whereas carb tolerance varies as you add more carbs, fewer and fewer people can tolerate it. You get up to higher levels. Just about everybody can adapt in a positive way to a low carb diet. Going back again to the fact it was just such a strong evolutionary adaptation to be able to survive without a lot of carbohydrates, that we all retain that ability or that metabolic program, if you will. It's just that if you're eating carbs, you're suppressing that, that metabolic program that is innate in all of us.
Well, that's the cruel irony of this all, that people are calling this a fad diet when this is our natural state for humans. And so to be in the fat burning state is very natural, and to be in the fasted state is very natural. So what are some other benefits of being fat adapted?
Well, I agree. That it's a little odd that we think a normal diet is one that's, high in carbohydrate and contains a lot of sugar. But that's just that's been the dogma for decades now. So that's how we sort of define normal. And if we talk about a diet that's taking away a major macronutrient like carbohydrate that's being recommended as being over half your calories coming from that particular nutrient, you sound radical and extreme. But again, when you look back at human history and how the body has evolved to use fuel and what it prefers to burn, it's actually quite normal to be consuming very little carbohydrate and relying on fat for fuel. And we're learning more and more every day about the health benefits of switching your metabolism from a carb dependent and carb based fuel to relying almost exclusively on fat and ketones for fuel. It's certainly helping diabetes, which is a carb intolerant disease. But beyond that, that is the most spectacular example of therapeutic effect of a ketogenic diet, is its ability to make somebody not have diabetes anymore. Whether you call that reversal or remission, in essence, is a semantic argument. But with somebody on a well-formulated ketogenic diet, they essentially don't have diabetes. But other diseases are showing some very promising results too, whether that be cancer. Several neurological conditions seem to be driven by part of this insulin-resistant phenotype that develops. We're close to, developing a critical mass of evidence to support that, but it's a little premature right now to make any definitive conclusions. But a lot of the animal data and small scale human trials in cancer and Parkinson's, for example, and Alzheimer's are promising. We just don't have the large randomized clinical trial data to make definitive statements about the therapeutic role of ketogenic diets. But I suspect over the next 5-10 years, we're going to see some of those studies published. I don't see it going backwards now. I mean, the genie's out. There's a lot of groups interested in ketogenic diets and studying it in a variety of different disease states. So we're going to continue to build on the last decade and a half of science that for the most part, it's all been positive.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really excited about this future stuff. And a lot of that was presented at the Metabolic Health Summit, of these people doing that research on cancer and Alzheimer's and these advanced topics. But just on the general basis of, say, weight loss over the past, 10, 15 years, when put up in a trial against high carb diets, the low carb diet basically always seems more effective. I mean, that's, if people aren't aware listening, that, there's many studies showing the efficacy of these low carb diets that's superior.
Absolutely. I mean, well, if you go back far enough, there was actually a lot of interest in weight loss as a primary outcome with ketogenic diets back in the 50s and 60s. But all that research stopped, with the onset of the USDA dietary guidelines in the late 70s and 80s. And so I call it the dark ages of nutrition, 70s, 80s, 90s. Because outside of a few exceptions, very little work was done. it was actually a toxic area to study if you were a scientist trying to do work in this area. But then up starting in around 2000, which is when I started to do work and a few others, that sort of began the resurgence and interest in ketogenic diets. And so, here we are almost 2 decades later, 2019, and there's just really been a steady influx of studies on ketogenic diets. And like you said, there's a lot of evidence for low carb diets being more effective than low fat, high carb diets for weight loss. And it's not a few studies or even a dozen studies. I mean, we're talking about literally 50, 100 studies now that have been reviewed in meta-analyses and systematic reviews showing greater effects of ketogenic diets. And that's despite the fact a lot of these ketogenic diets were less than optimal in terms of their compliance. Researchers studying this may or may not have had good intentions. A lot of the published work actually was done by skeptics that were in many ways trying to sabotage the ketogenic diet. And despite that, they often showed positive effects of low carb over high carb. But the implementation of the diets in many of these studies and the compliance was poor, probably because they weren't supporting people, the research subjects assigned to that group. But nonetheless, the diet is so potent, it often still resulted in significant improvements. So even when you account for that sloppiness, if you will, in a lot of the studies and noise in the research data in general, you still see a consistent benefit. But you really see it when there's high quality studies where investigators really understood how to formulate and implement the diet. You see the most impressive result. So there's no question. I mean, the science is at a point now, I consider it a critical mass where it's just, you can't ignore it.
Yeah,
People still do, but I mean, there's more than a couple studies now that are supportive. It's quite impressive when you search PubMed now and type in ketogenic diets and weight loss or some other term. There's just been an explosion of scientific support.
Yeah, the main thing is we just need to get this out in the mainstream, where the media just always attacks a low carb diet, and the mainstream person doesn't understand that there's all these studies out there, and US News will put the ketogenic diet as dead last in the rankings. And so that's sort of the biggest problem here, is just getting the word out. And also, you mentioned the poor study design sometimes is that it takes 2 or 3 weeks to get fat adapted. So a lot of these studies weren't even long enough to, show the good results of what happens when the person's metabolism changes.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of barriers and challenges yet, despite the fact the science is charging ahead and looks very promising. We're butting up against decades of dogma, and in many ways it transcends the science. We've got an economy built around carbohydrates. There's just a culture built around carbohydrates. We've got a medical community and profession that's built their career and reputation around low-fat diets, and many of those people that were, had a stake in that are still around in leadership positions. And so, as frustrating, as it is that it's taken this long to kind of start swinging the pendulum over to the other side, we are making tremendous progress and momentum in shifting over and shifting mindsets, but a lot of work yet to do. Still our dietary guidelines for Americans are pretty antiquated. They don't really reflect the science, in my opinion, and many people's opinions. They're still promoting restrictions in saturated fat, for example, and not acknowledging the body of knowledge out there on low carbohydrate diets. So they're very important to change those guidelines. Even if people don't read the guidelines, which they probably don't, they impact everybody through their programs and their impact on the food manufacturers, what we feed our kids in schools and what we feed our military, what we teach dietitians, et cetera, et cetera. So, we do have to approach this from the top down, but I think the most progress has been from the bottom up. I mean, there's just been a groundswelling of interest and support and grassroots type momentum here, but it's a dual strategy. We also at some point have to change policy in this country to kind of shift this over to accepting low carb diets, at least as an option. I mean, no one's saying this has to be the default, but it needs to be presented as an option for folks and not scare people away from it and create fear.
Well, I believe, okay, for one thing, it's crazy to do a one size fits all diet for 330 million people. And that's what they're trying to do with this food pyramid and low fat diet. But I'd like to see two dietary strategies. So maybe, yeah, we're not going to have everyone do the low carb diet, but like you said, it should be an option. But what if they had dietary strategy A and dietary strategy B? And B would be the low carb diet. Just don't be stuck in the middle where most Americans are, eating a high fat and high carb diet at the same time.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense, and that would be a huge improvement over what we have now. But I think we could even take it a step further and recommend the low carb approach as preferred if you have sort of this insulin resistant phenotype of obesity or prediabetes or diabetes. And you could imagine a list of factors or characteristics that people could look at to give them an idea of whether or not they had that phenotype, because we have the evidence now. If you're insulin resistant or carb intolerant, you do better with a low carb diet. If, on the other hand, you're insulin sensitive and you have good carb tolerance, you probably would do okay on either low carb or low fat,
Mm-hmm.
and you have more options. That is a pretty well established fact that has been borne out in many studies now. So we can start to personalize it just based on that sort of level of carb tolerance or insulin resistance.
Well, I think that'd be amazing. I was trying to be more realistic and just say as an option, but I mean, really, it should be the first option, especially since more than half of the people are overweight or some sort of chronic disease. So you talk about personalized nutrition, and I do think that's a future. And where are we with that? Do we know how to check someone's carb tolerance levels, or is there genetic biomarkers? Where are we at?
Well, we're very much scratching the surface. There was a lot of hope when we solved the human genome that, and then now we've made it relatively quick and less expensive to be able to genotype people, that this would open the door to personalized medicine, including personalized nutrition. But it turns out the variation in our genes from the structural perspective of whether or not you have a certain nucleotide variation, or a SNP, they call it, single nucleotide polymorphism, it explains a relatively low percent of the variation in most complex phenotypes like weight loss or response to carbohydrate or diabetes. So I think there's the promise of all that. There was so much hype around that. It's kind of taking the wind out of the sails a bit in the whole idea around personalized nutrition. But I think where there's a lot more promise is in looking at other biomarkers that change. See, your genes are relatively static. What's more important is what their expression levels and how they change in response to the food that you're consuming or responding to the exercise that you're doing and other types of behavioral or environmental factors. So that's where I think the promise in personalized nutrition is identifying certain biomarkers that give you feedback on whether or not you're processing food in a healthy way. So, for example, we're looking at some biomarkers that will tell us whether or not you're processing carbs in a healthy way. Because, carbs are fine if you can oxidize them and they're not accumulating in the body or being converted into fat and causing other collateral damage. So there are biomarkers that give us some idea whether or not you're mismanaging the carbohydrate that you're consuming. And to me, those have a lot of promise going forward. And we're still, again, at the early stages of understanding how to use these and identifying which markers are the best to give us an indication of how you're processing food. But that's where I see a lot of progress that will be made over the next decade or so. But right now, we don't have good tools, and there's very few biomarkers that are credible in terms of helping guide people to a nutrition plan. So people are kind of on their own to trial and error and figure out on their own what works for them. And that's fine. I think that's what people need to do. We just need to give them the best information if they're going to experiment with a low carb or a ketogenic diet on how to do that in an appropriate way.
Well, I know Rob Wolf has his carbohydrate test 7-day thing. Is that what you're kind of talking about, where you can test different carbohydrates and measure your blood glucose response to those? Is that the best we can do right now?
Well, that's one thing you could do is just measure your glucose responses. But a lot of times there's damage going on before your glucose regulatory system is disrupted. So there might be other ways to pick up on, some of this underlying pathology that's going on before you actually have prediabetes or worse. So, some of those, not to get too far into the weeds here, but some of those involve specific fatty acids, for example, that we know increase when your body's converting carbs to fat, so-called de novo lipogenesis. And that could be going on for weeks or months or even years before it actually manifests in a high blood sugar level. And during that time, a lot of damage could be happening. So having something that's a little more rapidly changing, sort of the canary in the mine shaft, if you will, to give you an early indication your body's not processing carbs in a healthy way would be valuable.
Yeah, I'm excited if you're working on that or other people are working on it, because I think so many people don't know the damage they're doing. And I get a lot of pushback because I'm talking about this way of eating and people say they're doing fine and they don't realize what's happening until it's too late. And it's so hard because maybe someone is looking fine or they're not really that overweight, but they're doing a lot of damage. So I guess you would just say, just try it. Just try the low carb and see if you feel better. And what do you even tell
Yeah,
people?
and a lot of my work in the lab is focused on ketogenic diets, and ketogenic diets are sort of a subset of low carb diets where you decrease carbohydrate and moderate protein to a level where you elevate ketones in the body. And so not all low carb diets are ketogenic diets, but all ketogenic diets are low in carb. And we're learning now that there's probably unique benefits of being in ketosis. And so in that regard, it's fairly easy to be able to know if you're in ketosis by measuring your blood levels of beta hydroxybutyrate, a primary circulating ketone. And so that right there gives you a nice, easy way to know if you're in ketosis, as a biomarker. And that's very sensitive. I mean, you eat one meal of carbohydrates and that can knock you out of ketosis. The problem is not everybody needs to be on a ketogenic diet. You might be a person who gets a lot of benefit from just restricting carbs a little bit, and there's not a need to be on a ketogenic diet. That's where we don't have the greatest biomarkers right now to know if you would do okay just moderately restricting carbs versus the full-on ketogenic diet. But it's not a bad place to start because we now know ketogenic diets are safe. They're, like I said earlier, almost everyone has the capacity to adapt to a ketogenic diet. So especially for people with diabetes, that's where we start them because we know that's going to sort of optimize the metabolic state. And for a lot of those folks, we encourage them to stay on a ketogenic diet because they either need to be at that level of carb restriction to maintain their health, or a lot of times people just feel so good, with that level of carb restriction and having the ketones elevated that they don't want to even try to add carbs back. But this is where we have a lot to learn yet on how to personalize the diet over the long term, and how to determine whether a person needs to be on a ketogenic diet or just some carb restricted diet, and what level of carb. That's where we don't have the tools and the knowledge to know how to do that accurately. So people are on their own. They have to experiment, and it's I tell people it's like a journey. I mean, you have to go on a personal journey here and, learn as much as you can how to do it right. And then it's just really your journey where you kind of self-experiment, monitor, and find what works for you.
Well, that's what I'm most interested in because I did low carb for a while and felt good. But then when I finally went pretty ketogenic and got really fat adapted, I had amazing results. But then I'm wondering, I don't stay in ketosis. I don't measure. I don't do any of this. But I'm trying to figure out, I guess it's just self-experimentation is, do I need to always be in ketosis or does it matter? And I mean, you do a lot of stuff, especially with Virta that we should talk about at Virta Health, putting diabetes into remission, type 2 diabetes, and building technology. And there's a lot going on there, but they need to be in therapeutic ketosis. And that's there's certain other diseases management like epilepsy and cancer where you definitely want to be in therapeutic ketosis. But for other people, what are your views on just an everyday person? Because to be in that level of therapeutic ketosis, you do need to moderate protein and it's pretty high fat. But I'm getting pretty interested in upping my protein and feeling pretty good, feeling great. And a lot of people are not restricting their fat so much and finding greater satiety, eating more protein. And so, yeah, what are your views on everyday people other than just self-experimentation, but just what do you think about protein?
Yeah, I mean, again, not everyone needs to be in ketosis, but I find it helpful to at least encourage people to at least try that and see how that works for them. And that's not trivial because, first of all, it can be challenging to get into ketosis in the first place, just because it represents a major change in the way people are eating. But then, it gets into this concept of well-formulated ketogenic diet. So there's a lot of components of a ketogenic diet that one needs to really understand and implement in an appropriate way in order to make it safe, effective, and perhaps most important, sustainable. And this extends, beyond just simply cutting your carbs down to induce ketosis. It gets into issues around how you choose the fat sources and mineral balance, in particular, making sure you're consuming adequate sodium and potassium. And so, these are things that a lot of people don't understand and don't pay attention to. And ultimately, the ketogenic diet won't be something they can stick with if they don't understand that and how they've put their meal plans together and so forth. So there is quite a bit to this, and I don't want to make it sound like rocket science either, because it's not something people can't achieve on their own without a PhD. But you have to also appreciate most of these factors we're talking about contradict current medical nutrition advice. So we're telling people you can embrace saturated fat in order to succeed on a ketogenic diet. You have to consume more sodium. I mean, these are in direct conflict with what current dietary recommendations say. And that can either be hard for people to just deal with, get their head around, but even if they understand and try to do that, their friends and colleagues and family, could be sabotaging them because they believe something else. So in the real world, this can be challenging to implement for a variety of reasons. And so people need not only good information, they need ongoing support in order to make this stick. But anyway, coming back to your question on, not everybody needs to do this, but I think it's helpful to have people kind of experience what it's like to be on a well-formulated ketogenic diet. And then they at least have the tools to be able to do that. If they decide that they can add some carbs back and still feel good and maintain their health, then that's great. But at least they have the knowledge and the tools to kind of regain their health if things start to slip, where they're gaining weight or not feeling well and having carb cravings. And they know how to get back into ketosis and kind of personalize it for them.
Yeah, I think it's really valuable to just try it for yourself. And it is a bit complicated, but it also can be as simple as eating meat and fish and eggs and vegetables. It's really just...
Yeah. No, it's true. It's not, I tell people it's not difficult, but it is challenging because you can take very smart people and give them all this information, and the majority of them will not be able to make it stick. Part of this is just a problem with the food landscape and, the culture and, the pressure to eat carbs that exist almost everywhere you go. So I don't want to trivialize it either, because the average person needs a lot of support to make this work.
It takes a while.
And it's getting better. More foods are out there, that are appropriate with the ketogenic diet, that are accessible. And so it is getting easier. And if you ask for extra butter when you're eating out now, you may not get a weird glance from your waiter or something. It is a little more accessible and acceptable, but still, challenging. And that's something Virta's really at the forefront of, being able to make this diet sustainable and being able to scale that.
Yeah. So Virta is great. I'm starting a company. I came up to you at the conference and told you, we're kind of copying you a little bit and building some technology similar to Virta. But I think it's so great that you guys are getting the communication, the accountability between doctors, health coaches, and the patient. I think it's really huge, like you said, to make it sustainable and make it work, is to have that communication and see real wearables, or, if it's a smart scale or some kind of technology that helps you know that you're in ketosis for the therapeutic reason, or if you're just tracking, it keeps you accountable.
Absolutely. I mean, the Virta was really focused on the type 2 diabetes problem, which is epidemic, really pandemic all over the world. There's just exploding rates of diabetes, and it's a huge economic problem too. And so we're really a company that's trying to transform healthcare and get healthcare costs under control by helping manage this diabetes problem. And in that regard, it does, at its core, involve a ketogenic diet and helping people, consume a whole food diet that gets them in ketosis, because that's really where the magic is in terms of getting their disease under control. The hard part, though, is supporting them and coaching them into this new lifestyle, and then dealing with the medical management and medications and things that need to be adjusted. So, that's where Virta has kind of put all those pieces together in a way that no one else has, and has done so in a way that's very scalable, so that we can basically implement this in not just a few thousand or a few 100,000, but tens of millions of people eventually. And so that really brings us into the telemedicine area that's getting a lot of traction now, and basically taking all our information that we would typically use to teach people in group classes or one-on-one counseling, and putting that into an app that can then be implemented to a much greater number of people, and also customized in a way that you just can't do with group classes. So it's pretty exciting, merging this cutting edge nutritional biochemistry and nutritional ketosis with, the technology out there and telemedicine and virtual coaching and so forth, and putting that all under one umbrella into one package that can really transform lives in a positive way and save a lot of money at the same time.
Yeah, I know big organizations are interested in using it because they realize the cost savings that if they're using your technology. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about, I know Dr. Sarah Hallberg was involved in studies. What are some of those numbers on the success rate?
Yeah, so I mean, our first goal in really getting the company off the ground was to prove that our program actually had a positive effect in patients with diabetes. So we were very fortunate to cross paths with Sarah Hallberg, who's a physician in Indiana University Health in Lafayette, who was using a ketogenic diet in her weight loss clinic. And we eventually partnered up, and we decided to run a clinical trial with her as the principal investigator, and she oversaw all our clinical patients. Just an extraordinary effort to recruit hundreds of patients and put them on our Virta program and manage them. And that study is still ongoing, but we've now published our 1-year data, and we hope to soon publish 2-year data. All the patients are past 2 years now. I believe a lot of them are past 3 years. So it's an ongoing data collection on these patients. But the results were nothing short of transformative, just really changing people's lives in terms of getting them off medications, the weight loss, and most important, reversing their diabetes. So, their blood sugars and hemoglobin A1C values in many patients were normalized, which is really unheard of, because diabetes is considered in the medical world as a chronic, progressive, irreversible disease. And we clearly demonstrate that that's not true. It can be reversed and put into remission, if you will. So that was the big finding. And then there's obviously a lot of cost savings that goes along with that, because people are not taking as many medications, and they're not, going to the emergency room as often and seeing their doctors, not to mention just better quality of life and those types of things. So that, as I said, that study's ongoing, but we've clearly demonstrated our program works. And, now the company is expanding and working with large companies and eventually insurance plans to scale this in the US for now, but eventually take this worldwide.
It's so great. I opened up the website. There's 60% of patients reverse type 2 diabetes, or I guess you could call it in remission. 94% decrease their medications. 39% reduction in inflammation, the CRP values, the lower triglycerides, 24% down, 55% average reduction in HOMA-IR. Like all this stuff is so awesome. And people thought it wasn't even possible because no one just looks at the simple dietary approach and always, going towards medications. But one more thing I want to get onto sort of athletics and athletic performance, and you do a lot of research on that, which is so cool. But the protein thing we kind of missed. I'm just curious about protein, and I've heard some other doctors talk about gluconeogenesis being demand driven, where, maybe you'll get kicked out of ketosis, yes, because protein does affect your insulin and blood sugar, but what are your views on it? Are you just trying to get people into this therapeutic ketosis zone and then you just can't have too much protein? But what about for, say, the everyday person? Should they be afraid of protein?
Well, the way I view protein in the context of a ketogenic diet is you eat enough protein to meet your nitrogen needs and you restrict the carbs enough, because it's really the carbs and the protein that determine whether or not you increase ketones. So fat doesn't have a major role in that. So fat, we tell people, eat to satiety and don't worry too much about quantity. Just eat until you're satisfied. But the carbs and protein, you have to kind of get in the right range in order to induce ketosis. And that varies from person to person. But the protein recommendations we provide are, around 1.2, perhaps all the way up to close to 2 grams of protein per kilogram reference body weight. And, that's actually higher than the RDA for protein. So that's not a low level of protein, but it's not a super high level either. So it's what I would call an appropriate or moderate amount of protein. And I don't see, a great need to go any higher than that, even if you're an athlete. That's more than enough protein to maintain or even build muscle if that's your goal. And, you just look at how protein functions in the body. We don't have a great capacity to store protein if we consume excess protein. It puts a stress on the body to get rid of the extra nitrogen. So I don't see a great rationale or reason to just overconsume protein above whatever you need for maintaining a positive nitrogen balance. And the thing about being in ketosis is that ketones have anti-catabolic effects. They decrease protein breakdown. So again, I don't see a big need to overdo protein in the context of a ketogenic diet.
Yeah, no, I kind of agree with you there. I just know some people who had just poor body composition on a keto diet, and I think myself included, and so I just upped my protein a bit, not saying go crazy, and saw a lot of good results.
Yeah, and part of that could be if you weren't attentive to the mineral requirements, when you were on a ketogenic diet, then that can actually affect your muscle mass just through a stress response. For example, if you're not consuming enough sodium on a ketogenic diet, you'd think, well, how is that going to impact muscle mass? Well, in addition to just feeling lousy because your plasma volume is depleted, that elicits a stress response, particularly adrenal stress, where you get aldosterone is released and even a sympathetic nervous system response. But the aldosterone will cause potassium to be wasted as it tries to reabsorb more sodium. And if you're in a negative potassium balance, that has negative impact on your protein status. So some of these factors that may or may not be addressed on a ketogenic diet could end up impacting muscle mass. So, when people say they had an adverse response to a ketogenic diet, that's sort of the first thing I think about is, well, were you really attentive to all these various components of a ketogenic diet that are necessary? And in many cases, they weren't. They perhaps weren't understanding all these various factors.
That makes sense. So going on with this athletics and performance, you have a second book, The Art and Science of Low Carb Performance. And I know you had an interesting lecture that I heard about at the conference that I unfortunately missed. I was up doing interviews. But can you talk about that? You talked about the military earlier.
Yeah, the whole sports nutrition and exercise metabolism scientific field has in many ways paralleled what's happened with general nutrition guidelines. It kind of goes back to the 60s and 70s, where you had Scandinavian researchers who were just identifying glycogen in muscle as important, and that led to the concept of carbohydrate loading back, in the late 60s, early 70s. And another really important thing happened around that time. You have at the University of Florida, it was one of the coaches there invented Gatorade. And shortly after that, you have Gatorade, and the Gatorade Sports Science Institute formed, and that really influenced decades of exercise scientists and people studying carbohydrate as a nutrient for athletes. But the point is, you have from 1960s all the way to current times, you have this sort of supremacy of carbohydrate as the predominant theory of what athletes should be consuming. So even today, current guidelines are consume as much carbohydrate as possible before, during, and after exercise. It's really insane. And you've got a multi-billion-dollar sports beverage industry that's supporting this and profiting from this. And, my feeling is we need to radically change the way we think about fueling athletes, that instead of encouraging as much carbs before, during, and after exercise, that athletes should be consuming as few carbs as possible while still maintaining optimum performance and health. And that's a subtle difference, but really important, because there's a downside to over consuming carbs. And metabolically, the big downside is as you eat more carbs, you prioritize oxidizing those carbs, but at the same time, you inhibit your ability to burn fat. So you become dependent on carbs and glucose. And over time, this bruises the body, if you will. It's like the body absorbing blows week after week, month after month, year after year. And there's so many examples of athletes who may be able to get away with that for a while, or even quite a while. But as they get older and hit middle age, suddenly there's no amount of exercise that prevents them from developing prediabetes or even diabetes or gaining weight. I mean, there's just example after example. So, I always tell people you can't outrun a bad diet. Eventually it catches up to you. So I won't deny that there might be some benefit to including carbohydrates for performance benefit in certain cases. But again, we shouldn't be trying to just maximize the carbs we're eating. We should be trying to get good performance and good health while eating as few carbs as possible, because that helps promote and enhance your body's ability to burn fat. And we're coming back to what we kind of talked about at the beginning. There's just so much evidence that if you have a greater ability to burn fat, that's preferred, both from a health perspective and I think even from a long-term athletic perspective, that the body is healthier and recovers better if it's primarily burning fat.
Yeah, and you kind of rewrote the textbooks with some of your VO2 max studies, if you want to touch on that really quickly.
Well, yeah, we did a study it's been about 6 or 7 years ago, called the FASTER study, and it was quite simple in that we just wanted to understand what these low-carb athletes looked like, because there was a lot of athletes in the ultra-endurance world who had switched over from their carb loading to a very low-carb diet, and turns out they were doing really well. There were several examples of low-carb, fat-adapted athletes that were winning races, and in some cases setting records. So we just really wanted to get them in the lab and study them to see what made them so effective, because by many standards, they shouldn't be able to perform that well if they weren't eating a lot of carbohydrates. So anyway, we were successful in getting several high caliber fat adapted athletes in the lab. We also had equally impressive traditional high carb athletes that we studied as a sort of control or comparison group. And we're still learning from that study, but the most striking finding was their extraordinary ability to burn fat. The peak rates of fat burning were at least 50% higher than the highest rate ever recorded. So we documented that in one of our first papers. And they were also, during sustained exercise, they're able to burn almost exclusively fat. Was another really sort of impressive finding. So they could run for 3 hours on our treadmill, burning almost 90% of their energy from fat. So there's just a huge sparing of carbohydrate and glucose that occurs in the fat adapted state. And this is a huge advantage if you're an ultra athlete running, or cycling for many hours. It's very hard to keep up eating enough carbohydrate to fuel that kind of exercise. And it ends up tearing up their GI tracts and things. And when they go on the low carb diet and become really efficient fat burners, they don't have the need to fuel as much during exercise. And it's just much more tolerable and improves their enjoyment of exercise as well. I mean, that's one of the more common anecdotes we hear from these fat adapted athletes. They recover faster, they enjoy exercise more, they're just not as dependent on constantly eating fuel, which in a lot of cases is just sugar and processed carbs to get, quick energy in.
Well, sounds like it has great military applications. If you spend a few more minutes before you have to go on that.
Yeah, I mean, the metabolic adaptations, I think, are really just part of a very sort of pleiotropic nature of ketogenic diets. So the enhanced fat burning is certainly important and features prominent, but, we're interested in how it affects cognitive function too. And there's increasing evidence that when the brain's using ketones, that it functions more efficiently. So, that has application for the operator and the special ops soldier or the general that needs to make important decisions when they're sleep deprived. But geez, who doesn't want to function smarter and have better cognitive clarity and so forth? So there's broad spectrum applications there too. So we're interested in understanding that. And the whole recovery aspect of it too really gets into other areas such as the effects of ketones on inflammatory pathways and their association with less oxidative stress, perhaps better immune functioning and so forth. All of these would play into an ability to recover faster and cope with stress more efficiently. So those are complicated areas to study, but nonetheless fruitful areas from our perspective. So we're trying to chase down some mechanisms and applications there as well. And, even traumatic brain injury is a big problem in the military. And there's animal data now that the ketone-fueled brain has protection from these traumatic blunt force type of situations that many soldiers, whether it's in training or from blasts, from IEDs. So if we have the good fortune to get funding, which we're waiting to hear back on, we'll be able to actually study whether or not being in ketosis has any protection from traumatic brain injury. So that's just a few examples of areas that we're pursuing, but there's just so many targets that need to be studied with ketosis. One way I describe it is that, we now understand ketosis is a big hammer, and there's so many nails that really need to be chased down. We've got some fantastic data in diabetes and epilepsy and reducing seizures, but all these other diseases are very promising, and I'd be shocked if we didn't, find some really impressive results with future studies, but we do need to do those studies. And that's what we're trying to move forward here at Ohio State, and many other people as well across the country and across the world that are now, really dedicated to studying this, which is great.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I know you guys are doing great things in the lab. So is that kind of what the future is looking like for you guys, these kind of applications? And
yeah, and then, the challenge is still the funding is really competitive and limited to investigate ketogenic diets. So, it's going to take time. Science moves slow, and it moves even slower when you don't have a lot of funding. So, that's still a challenge, and we need to support funding, whether it be federal sources of funding or philanthropic or foundation support. We need to support researchers and scientists who are trying to advance the knowledge, and so it's going to take a while to do the studies and fund the studies, but it's all looking very positive. And finally, like I said earlier, shining light on this rather than scaring people away from it and keeping it in the shadows. So it's way past due, and so it's exciting to be part of all this.
Well, I think it's exciting that when I was at the conference filming an interview with you in San Diego, you came off stage, and it's so great to see that you were like a rock star. People were crowding around. It took us half an hour to get up to the room to shoot. So I'm glad that people are so excited about this kind of research and what you're doing. And that was pretty cool to see. So thanks for...
It's a little surreal. I have to admit, it's refreshing and encouraging to get that type of response. I don't know if that conference represents the reflection of necessarily the mindset in the country right now, or even my colleagues, but it's certainly appreciated because, when I started doing this 20 plus years ago, there were only a few of us, and it was lonely. So happy to talk and share, with anybody who wants to listen.
Yeah, it was so awesome. People were trying to get the autographs and telling you their story and how, you changed their life and this and that. So that was really cool. And hopefully we'll just keep spreading the message, this podcast, the film, and just putting your work on display and other people out there doing this research. So thank you so much. And I'll let you get to your next meeting.
All right. Well, thanks, Brian. Appreciate you getting the good word out to as many people as possible.
Absolutely. Hey everyone, it's me again. Who would have thought? Just wanted to give everyone a friendly reminder to please support the Food Lies film at foodlies.org. We really need your support to finish the film. Please leave this podcast a review on iTunes or the Apple Podcast app and say hi on social media. Just search Food Lies on any platform. Thanks so much and see you next week.